Hello, everyone. Now, the Ukraine narrative that has been pushed in the West by governments and the mainstream media is collapsing, thanks to President Trump mainly and J.D. Vance and what happened last week in the White House, where they just basically gave Zelensky enough rope to hang himself, and he did. And he looked utterly intransigent and very tetchy and very, very unpleasant when Trump was offering him a deal to try to stop the war in the Oval Office. And you've seen the video, I'm sure, of when they got into a big argument. Here's just a sample photograph of what happened there. You can see them arguing. And of course, Zelensky was incredibly disrespectful to J.D. Vance and President Trump when he went over there. You would think that someone who had been in a war for 3 years and is clearly losing that war, it's a tragedy for the Ukrainian people and the Russian people who have lost hundreds of thousands, of soldiers each. Perhaps over 1 million young men have died between the two sides. You'd think that he would want to bring it to an end, just as quickly as possible, which is what President Trump wants to do, which is what I've said all along. And a few lone voices in the West have been calling this out from the very beginning, saying this didn't need to happen. This war should never have started. And certainly when there was a peace deal on the table, just 2 months after the beginning of the special military operation in April 2022 between Putin and Zelensky, Biden dispatched Boris Johnson to go and persuade Zelensky not to sign a peace agreement, to keep the war going. And then we've had another 3 years of slaughter completely unnecessarily. Well, this needs to stop. And you would think that Zelensky would want to do that. But he doesn't seem like he wants to do that, even though he was offered a deal, offered a way out, and he didn't take it. So then he went off to London, of course, as you've seen, and he got a far warmer welcome from the tyrant in Downing Street at the moment, Keir Starmer. And he is a tyrant because of everything that we know he's been doing in this country, in interfering in the justice system to lock up people who are using their free speech, and he's trying to take farms away from families by imposing inheritance tax and keep this war going. Now, you're not really sure exactly what he stands for because he seems to give a few mixed messages here. In the statement after he met Zelensky in Downing Street, he seemed to say, well, we are going to put boots on the ground, British boots on the ground in Ukraine, and supply air support to peacekeep. But this needs to be backed up by the US, and the US is now making it clear that they want out. They're not going to give any more money or weapons to Ukraine. They're not going to be involved unless they actually can bring this to a close and get a peace deal. So when Keir Starmer goes off and says, well, we're going to put British boots on the ground, and is not really clear about what that means, this is incendiary. And this is language that could lead to the beginning of World War III, if we're not in it already. Thank goodness that Russia has not escalated the conflict in the way that they've been provoked to escalate it, because Western leaders, whether it's in the UK, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, Starmer, they've all sung the same tune: escalate, escalate, escalate. We need to push Putin back to where he was pre-2014 and win this war and stop him from rolling his tanks across Europe. And this is the lie. This is one of the lies. Two lies, basically, which have been presented to the people in the West by the governments and by the mainstream media. The first is that Putin woke up one morning in February 2022 and decided to invade Ukraine with no reason whatsoever. There's no backstory, nothing led up to it. He just decided he was going to invade a country because he's an evil tyrant. Well, this is an absolute lie, because there's a lot of things that led up to this. I'll get into that in a minute. And the other lie that they're told, that they tell us, is that we need to stop Putin because otherwise he's going to roll his tanks all the way to the Atlantic and destroy freedom and democracy in the West. Well, there's very little freedom and democracy in the West left. I mean, in the UK, we have elections being cancelled in this year, in May 2025. 9 local council areas have seen their elections being cancelled, areas where the Uniparty is set to lose a lot of seats to challenger parties like the Heritage Party. We've had Romania's election has been cancelled, the result annulled, because the person who is going to win that election clearly is a threat to the globalist world order. And the judges in Romania's constitutional court have said that the election results can't stand, the second round can't go ahead. They want to stop Carlin Georgescu from becoming the president of Romania just at the time when NATO is expanding and trying to expand and putting it's one of its biggest ever new military bases being constructed right on the border of Ukraine in Romania there. We've had the president of Slovakia, Peter Fico, nearly assassinated in an assassination attempt last year. And in Ukraine itself, Zelensky cancelled the elections, which were due to happen last year. So he's now an illegitimate president. He's banned all opposition political parties. He's taken control of all the big state television companies, and then, well, they're not state, they are state television companies now, but the independent media doesn't exist in Ukraine because he's taken control of them, and now they're run by the state, and they can only say things which puff up Zelensky. So there's no independent media, there's no opposition political parties in Ukraine. So much for freedom and democracy in the country that all the collective West is saying that they support to affirm freedom and democracy. In fact, you've got more freedom and democracy in Russia than you have in the West, and certainly in Europe. There are over 10 times as many people in prison in the UK than in Russia for things that they've said on social media. And given that the UK is only less than half the population of Russia in terms of people, that is incredible. So, over 20 times as many people in prison per capita in the UK for speech crimes than in Russia. So there is far, far less freedom and free speech, certainly in the UK and other countries in Western Europe, than there is in Russia. So everything that the leaders are saying about building up and fighting for defending freedom and democracy is an absolute lie and an absolute sham, obviously. Now, the reason why Putin went into Ukraine is twofold. Of course, we know that there was a Western-backed coup in Ukraine where the democratically elected president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted because Yanukovych did not want to take Ukraine into NATO. But it's been the plan of NATO to expand into Ukraine for a very, very long time. And of course, in the interim, between 2014 and 2022, the Russian-speaking minority in the Donbass was pummeled and shelled and treated with absolute tyranny by Poroshenko and then Zelensky. At least 14,000 ethnic Russians in the Donbass were killed by shells and military action when they should have been just left alone and respected and as citizens and people, and not brutalized by the Ukrainian regimes, which are backed up by real neo-Nazis like the Azov Battalion and so on. So going back to NATO, that's the other thing, which a lot of people have spoken about, including Douglas McGregor and Jeffrey Sachs, that this is NATO. The dark blue areas are where NATO was in 1990, where after German reunification, East Germany joined NATO, obviously because Germany was reunified, and the Soviet Union was collapsing, and Russia came out of that a couple of years later. But then they said, okay, fine, but only if you agree not to expand NATO anymore. And NATO at the time said, yes, we won't move 1 inch further to the east than East Germany. But since that time, since 1997 up to 2025, all of the areas in light blue have been added to NATO. So 10 countries in Eastern Europe, and then initially, and then also Croatia and North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania. So that's 14 countries essentially in Eastern Europe. And then most recently, Sweden and Finland. And now, of course, NATO wants to expand into Ukraine and probably also wants Belarus as well, and Georgia, and maybe Armenia as well. So they want to take Moldova too, I imagine, want to take on a lot of countries that were in the former Soviet Union and bring them into the orbit of NATO. Why? I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any reason that this needs to happen. So NATO is now become an organization and an institution that is actually making life less safe. Yes, back in the 70s and 80s when there was the Cold War, it did keep us safe through mutually assured destruction. That's not very comforting, but there was that threat. Two sides, have got weapons that can destroy each other, and there was an understanding that they wouldn't use them, and that to some extent kept us safe. There wasn't a nuclear war in the 1970s and the 1980s, but now here we are, 35 years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And NATO is an organization that is actually making life far, far more dangerous, because they seem to just want to poke the bear non-stop. And they are hell-bent on trying to get Ukraine into NATO. And of course, Putin, that is his absolute red line. Ukraine does not join NATO. NATO agreed they wouldn't expand 1 inch to the east, and then they've taken in 16 countries since that time, and now trying to get Ukraine in. It simply is something that NATO should not be trying to do. They should be just leave things as they are and not try to stoke up a war. This does not need to escalate. And as President Trump has shown us, we can de-escalate instantly, and Putin is still ready to talk and listen, and he's not going to roll his tanks all the way across Europe to the Atlantic unless, ironically, what the NATO leaders in Europe are now doing is actually more likely to make that happen than if they had just not tried to expand and tried to cooperate and get on with Russia like we did in the 2000s. There was an 8-year period where the G7 became the G8. Russia joined in those meetings, and Russia was very, very much more on friendly terms with the West than it is now. And that's all due to the derangement of the leaders that we have in Western nations, most Western nations. No, there are some exceptions like Viktor Orban of Hungary and Peter Fico of Slovakia, but most Western European nations, and then Canada as well, are hell-bent on escalating the situation with Russia and saying we're going to support Ukraine to the end, whatever that means. So this was a meeting in Lancaster House in London after the press conference and meeting between Starmer and Zelensky. You can see I think Starmer's in there somewhere, and Zelensky's in there, and Ursula von der Leyen is there, and Trudeau is there, and Donald Tusk is there. Giorgia Meloni is there, which is disappointing. Mark Rutte is there. You'd expect. So all these people, mostly globalists, are puffing up Zelensky and pledging that they're going to give him the security needs, keep on giving him billions and billions of pounds and euros now that America is not giving any more, which is very sensible of President Trump. I think under Biden, the USA gave Zelensky something like $161 billion in lethal aid, which is just to pay for their military, to give them weapons, and that's escalated from armored vehicles to javelins to HIMARS to ATACMS, and then we got Challenger tanks from the UK, Leopard tanks from Germany. Then there were the Storm Shadow weapons from the UK, which was really silly to give Ukraine that and start firing them into Russia. And then there's talk of F-16s. And now Keir Starmer is saying, well, we're going to have boots on the ground now. We're actually going to send British troops to Ukraine, and other Western European nations are saying, pretty much the same thing. And they all met there in London to try and talk about this and discuss this. Now, President Trump has basically pulled the rug on American involvement in this, and the sensible thing for Western European leaders to do is to just fall in line and say, yeah, okay, we're going to try and stop this war now. There's been 3 years of slaughter. They don't care about the nearly 1 million Ukrainians have died and hundreds of thousands of Russians have died. They don't care about their own people. They don't care about young British, German, French, Italian men. They don't give a monkey's about the people of the Western Europe who may have to go and lose their lives in Ukraine. But Zelensky is seeming to say, well, yes, American soldiers, European soldiers will have to come and they will have to die in Ukraine. Well, sorry, Zelensky, you can, without swearing, stick that idea where the sun doesn't shine. No way, matey. That wouldn't happen under my watch. If I was in charge at all. We need to end this conflict, and we need to make peace with Russia and get back to normal relations with Russia. And this situation that has been utterly appalling and devastating and destructive to everyone involved. There's no good thing has come out of this at all. It just needs to stop. And we need to go back, if we can, to the Minsk agreements for Ukraine, accept that the territory that Russia is now in control of in Crimea and Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Luhansk will stay as Novorossiya in Russian hands, and put an armistice on the front lines that we have today, stop the slaughter, and just get back to normal relations. Because if we trade together and we talk to each other and we allow people to visit each other and make friends with each other on an individual basis, which is what things were like 20 years ago, then that's better for everybody. And this chapter, this terrible chapter in European history, needs to come to a close. And I think perhaps the only way it will come to a close is if all the people in this photo are gone. They need to be gone, and they need to be gone soon. I'm trying to work at doing that through the ballot box democratically. So please come and support me if you're in the UK. In the Heritage Party, we're the only party that has been against the Ukraine war from the start, and also speaks out against all the other things that need to be spoken out against, which have happened over the last 4 years, such as lockdowns, experimental injections, net zero, mass immigration, relationships and children, just sexual education for children, sexualization of children, grooming gangs, the undermining of free speech, two-tier justice, all of these things. We're the only party that speaks against all of those things. So please do come and join me if you can join as a member for the Heritage Party in the UK. And what we want to do now to make a difference, we have a chance of standing in local elections in many places in England on the 1st of May 2025. As I said, obviously some of the elections have been cancelled, but you still have local councils that fly Ukrainian flags from the county halls and city halls around the country, which is utterly ridiculous. I mean, there should only be an English flag or a British flag flying in England. Obviously, in Scotland, you can have a Scottish flag flying. In Wales, you can have a Welsh flag flying as well. But there should not be any Ukrainian flags flying from Kent County Council offices or Hertfordshire County Council or Gloucestershire County Council head offices, for example. This just needs to stop. And, why politicians of the Uniparty are supporting this Ukraine war and continuation of slaughter, both at national level and local level, is beyond me. It needs to stop, and we need to get back to sanity. So that's where we are. Good for President Trump for changing the course of things. He is going to make a difference, but the European leaders, I fear, are completely deranged about this, and they're doubling down again after doubling down so many times before. And, if they're not stopped, they might get us into World War III. And we cannot let that happen, because Europe will be destroyed one way or another. Maybe some of the buildings will, but then we do not want hundreds of thousands or millions of young Christian men to go and be killed for nothing. So let's stop it. Thanks for listening, everybody. God bless you all.